Here's a little introduction to images, presentation that it will make sense to have before you do an image resize. You read about images. We'll move more heavily into using some images in a bigger exercise next week. Back in the old days, there were really only 3 web image formats. When I say old days, I mean like 3 years ago. These are still very valid and still the most common image formats on the web. JPEG, or JPG, is what you should be very common with. It's what almost all your photos are. It's been around for a long time. Very good file format. GIF, I say GIF anyway, some people say GIF. GIF and PNG, we see the letters out, are also been around for a long time. They are most commonly used for things that have big chunks of solid color, like logos or other pieces of art, which is more graphical, as opposed to JPEGs, which have like lots of different shades and gradations and a lot more detail in them. So that's the reasons we use GIFs and PNGs. And then we also use GIFs for animation. Oh, geez, I should have brought this up first. But, of course, one of the most common things that we have on the web is GIFs for animation. Like, for instance, the cat gets freaked out by a clothespin, which is everyone's favorite. That's been around for a long time. 2014. Wow, that's amazing. GIFs and PNGs are also used when we need transparency. JPEGs don't do transparency. So if you want some transparency around something, you use GIFs and PNG. And if you have multiple levels of transparency, you definitely need a PNG then. What would be that? It would be an example of that. Let's say you have a logo on a transparent background, but it also has a drop shadow. Drop shadows are semi-transparent usually. So you have multiple levels of transparency. You definitely need a PNG for that. This is a table from your textbook that explains it's in same stuff in a little more depth and different language and so on, about how you choose them. And we go through the same file formats. And also this mentions the best bitmap or raster file formats. That's what these all are what we call bitmap or raster file formats. You've already put a bunch of images into HTML, and you've seen them before. IMG src equals quotation mark. That's the path, which, as we know, could very well be a more complicated path. Or if it's sitting right there in the same folder, it's just the file name. And then we always want to use alt text. Yes, the image will appear even without it, but we're considering it mandatory because of accessibility. Alt text is needed for the visually impaired, people who turn off images, and in the case if the image is not available, if the image disappears for some reason, and for SEO. But here's something else you didn't know probably, is that you can include width and height. And if you do include width and height attributes also in your IMG, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 attributes now, all inside the same tag, right? If you include width and height, then your images will actually load a little faster because it's like the space will be reserved for them in the HTML before the image even arrives. Although these days we don't do that so much, we tend to reserve the size for the image in CSS, but it could be done either or both ways. But whatever we do, and by the way, do you notice that these numbers don't have a unit on them? The width and the height. The unit, we assume the unit is pixels. More on pixels in a minute. The assumed unit for images is pixels. But we never use these numbers to resize an image. It's really important that you size the image the size that you want it, the size it's supposed to be, and then that's the numbers that you use. So it really appears at its real size. And we don't resize images with HTML. If it was a really big image and we resized it down in HTML, then the result would be we'd be putting on our website an image that was way too big and would slow down, make things go slow, the download. On the other hand, if it was a really small image, we try to size it up bigger, it would look terrible. It would look all bitted out, all fuzzy. More on images. Images are inline elements. That means they must go inside a block element. Images can be links. We've already done that. You can find the file size of an image with a right click and open it in a tab. I guess I'll go to our website because it suggested I should do that. I forgot I was going to be doing this. We want to find an image. Now, the problem is that a lot of these images are kind of lots of other stuff on them. Let's go to learn more on biology. See if we can find an image. These images, that's an image in a carousel. Not a good choice. Here's a these images are a little bit different also. Let me come back to that. Let me go to a bit more of a perhaps a sort of simpler website. Sure, Clinton County Health Department, why not? And it's a carousel, but it's still a real image that's there and not programming. Whenever I find an image, I can say open image in new tab. If it's a real image and not something else that's been created with other kinds of programming. And when I do, open image in new tab, sorry, I didn't do that. Open image in new tab, I hover over it and I can see the size of it. It shows me the image, but it also shows me the size. It's 7,900 and something. Oh, that's the name of it. It also tells me the name of it. It's 914 by 385 pixels. So I can find the size of an image if I do a right click and open image in new tab, and also it will tell me the name of the image as it was saved, actual file name. Okay, that was a little tangent. More on images. There are newer image types. These are vector images. No longer bitmap. SVGs, scalable vector graphics, are shapes and paths that are defined mathematically, represented as text. The other types of images that we did earlier, those were bitmap or raster images. They are arrangements of pixels. So imagine that an SVG is actually not so much like a thing, like an actual, almost physical-like thing, a representation of lots of little dots. They're all lined up. An SVG is really just the instructions about how to draw something. The SVGs are faster, smaller, and can be resized, and can be animated. They actually can be written as text. They tend to be replacements for PNGs and GIFs, though, because they don't handle JPEG kind of information that well. If you want to know more about, we will be doing an exercise in SVGs in the future. We're going to skip over them a little bit now, but I can show you in this SVG, try it yourself at the W3 schools, WC3 schools, W3 schools. We could say, let's look at a rectangle. There's a rectangle. And we can see that this is actually the text that drew that rectangle. And it just says, give it a width, give it a height. It's a rect with a width and a height and a style and a stroke and so on. And then we include a little note here. This would be a note that would be to appear in people's browsers that they don't support SVGs, because SVGs are kind of new. So they're not supported by, well, older browsers anyway. And we can go to something more complicated. Well, it's not that complicated. It's just like a little stair step. And these points are set, and that's how it is drawn. So they're instructions for drawing, and not like a thing, like a bunch of dots, like a JPEG or the other bitmap images are. And there's even newer file types. There's something called a WebP and something called a JPEG XR. These are bitmap formats, but they have better quality and better compression than JPEG, for instance. But they're not fully supported yet. You may see them around a little bit. I don't see them that much yet, but maybe eventually we'll be moving to these file formats. So image formats, things do change and adjust to them. All right, since we're talking about images, we should talk about the sizes of things, so because that's a lot what images is about, and what the images are made up of, at least the way we create the sizes, or the sizes that we list, and that has to do with pixels. A pixel is the smallest unit of visual display, smallest digital unit, the smallest dot, for instance, like the smallest dot that your digital display will show you. So a bigger image has more pixels in it, right? CSS3, which is like the most modern standard of CSS, which is what we will be using more and more. It kind of tries to standardize pixels to 72 pixels per inch. This is a much more complicated thing than that. There's a lot more to the actual resolution, the number of pixels per inch that are displayed on certain kinds of displays and so on. But we will just say that in general, for the web, we use 72 pixels per inch, 72 ppi. That's how we write it. And when we make images, that's the standard we will use, and it will work fine. And just so you know, in general, when we think about, if we're going to think about sizes of things, maybe we think about our screen size. This is a bit old-fashioned, but when we think about desktop screens, the W3C screen standards are 1024 pixels by 768 pixels. But when we remove the browser, all the fixtures and furnitures on the browser, like scroll bars and things like that, we generally say the true width of a good number of what we use is like 980 or 960. That's how wide we generally think that desktop and laptop screen sizes are to accommodate a normal size web page. That many pixels. So you start to imagine the average web size is about 960 pixels wide. So therefore, something that's 400 pixels wide is nearly half the size of the normal size browser window. But of course, screen sizes change a lot. And we say that by 700, when we say 700, we talk about it being above the fold. Above the fold is the idea that the things that appear on the screen before you start to scroll, above the scrolling point, are usually the most important. That above the fold idea is an old idea, an old term that comes from newspapers actually, that when we had the idea that the newspaper page one was folded, right? There was a fold, and what appeared above the fold was the most important. There's no fold on your computer screen, except there sort of is, because it's the point at which you can't see the stuff below because you haven't scrolled yet. So that's the general numbers we use for screen sizes. And that's a little run through of some things about images that should help give you some background information.